Right, our third presentation this afternoon, the final presentation, is from Dr. Peter Mackie, who will be known to many of you. Pete is a reader in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff and has extensive research experience, particularly in the field of homelessness. Like our previous speakers, Pete is a cash co-investigator, and he's also the knowledge exchange lead for cash in Wales. Together with Suzanne Fitzpatrick at Heriot-Watt University, Pete has been leading the cash work on homelessness, and he's going to talk about some of that work and no doubt the ongoing work on the COVID-19 crisis response to homelessness, which again is across the four nations. So I can see Pete's presentation up on the screen, so I will hand over to Pete for the third and final presentation.
Brilliant, thanks Bob. Can you you can see the slides and see me? Is that somebody give me a yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I knew it'd be you that say yes. Brilliant, thank you. I can see nothing. I've had this fun of watching other people. It's such a disconcerting thing, isn't it? You can all disappear off to the toilet. What will we do when we end up back in physical conferences and you can't just nip to the loo in the middle with nobody noticing? Anyway, now you're back at your seats. The goal of the presentation is just to reflect on about 4 studies that I've been involved in for cash. Well, 3 of them I've been involved in, one I haven't, around homelessness, to give a real whistle-stop tour of the key findings of those, and then to reflect on what we might take forward for government. But the reality is actually we've got a pretty good environment in terms of the relationship between evidence and policy in Wales around homelessness. So even when the research is ongoing, it's often feeding into policy and practice as we go. So many of the recommendations or the findings are already shaping policy and practice. And you'll see that as we go through, but there'll also be plenty of time at the end just to reflect and to have a wee chat about all this. Right. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'll do very, very quickly a little bit about the homelessness context, look backwards before we look forwards, then talk about the evidence base. That's the majority of the presentation, and then finally talk through just some priorities for the next government. So homelessness in Wales context. Oh, we could go back as far as you like, but my memory's not good for those that know me. So we'll go back 10 years, and many of you on this call will remember the 10-year homelessness plan that was 2009 to 19. Now that plan had, for a 10-year plan, it didn't have the most ambitious of goals, the vision of reducing homelessness and its impact. And I remember explicitly the conversations that led to that plan. I was still at Shelter Cymru at the time, and it was quite a deliberate choice to aim to reduce homelessness rather than to end or seek to end homelessness. And the reason I put that there is partly because I think we've come quite a long way since that point in terms of action. And also one of the commitments in that plan was to look at the legislation again, which hadn't been looked at properly since the 70s. And then, of course, the next key step, I'd argue, was the Housing Wales Act, where we really did revisit the legislation, developed a new legislative framework that brought prevention into the legislative framework, at least what we would call crisis prevention. And fundamentally, the important change was that we brought in assistance for all, reasonable steps for all households, not just the priority need system that existed before. So a real step change and a major change in homelessness policy in Wales. More recently, kind of at the end of the 10-year plan, we had the strategy for preventing and ending homelessness from Welsh Government. And you can see the step change in that 10 years in terms of the goals. So they talk about preventing homelessness, and where it can't be prevented, ensure it's rare, brief and unrepeated. And I think that's a far better set of goals. It's a very brief document, but sets out a clear set of goals, and a lot of the messaging in there reflects some of the evidence I'm going to talk through now. More recently, we had the Homeless Action Group, and that kind of went in parallel and then a little bit after that strategy. And some of the key changes there in the discourse there was, a real shift towards seeing homelessness not just as a housing issue, but a real collective public services issue and agenda that we need to be working together around. And not just in the work of the action group, but in pretty much every report, research study that's come out in the last 2 or 3 years, I've never seen such a focus on the workforce as is beginning to emerge in policy and research. And things in practice are beginning to change around the workforce. So I think that's an important area that we're seeing emerge. And of course, the action group moves us beyond the Housing Wales Act and says, actually, the prevention work within the Housing Wales Act is focused on crisis. Let's move upstream further. And the prevention framework around which the action group's reports are based is the cash, is the typology advanced by cash. And then most recently, we've got COVID and the pandemic and the fundamental changes that have emerged as a result of that, informed by everything that's gone before, but some really important fundamental changes. Two of the key changes are that we've been accommodating everybody, or seeking to accommodate everybody, removing barriers, including legislative barriers like priority need. So that's a bit of the context. Now on to what that's meant. Look, these are just some of the statistics around the homelessness legislation. 2 key points to make. One is, in this relatively recent period, this last decade, prevention has come into the law, and we see a whole load of activity happening around this crisis prevention. But we've reached a kind of plateau within the legislation. We're ready to move to the next stage, to seek to prevent more effectively and reduce homelessness further. And in terms of rough sleeping, oh my goodness, the data is not great. If we look at the annual one-night count, again, it showed a steep rise and then a kind of plateauing in terms of numbers. COVID, we've seen lots of people brought in, but I think everybody would agree that a lot of the legislative changes haven't really helped in addressing rough sleeping. Some of the practice changes, particularly under COVID, have. So that's just the context, a whistle-stop tour of context. Now on to the research. So the 4 studies. The first one at the start of CASH was a joint study with Crisis. That was an international review of an awful lot of evidence, 500 studies we reviewed to look at what works in ending rough sleeping. This wasn't focused on prevention, but what helps to end rough sleeping once it's occurred. And there's a whole load of evidence on particular interventions, but what we sought to do is then look at and draw out the learning on the principles of what works. And just 4 or 5 of those. So at the very starting point, at the bedrock, and this very much meets with what Paul was saying, is look, if we're developing policy, if we're developing legislation or practice, the experience of those who've been through homelessness, face homelessness, has to underpin those interventions, those policies, those practices. The second point is about heterogeneity. So often we develop policy and practice and it fails because we fail to recognise the heterogeneity of people's capabilities and needs, and also local housing markets and contexts. The third key principle about what works is be fast, take swift action. This is very much about rapid rehousing and other things, and for instance, no second night out in England. But under traditional systems, we basically wait. We wait till things worsen, and we see all the negative outcomes of that. So swift action in our responses. We need to treat things with more urgency. And again, COVID has illustrated what can be achieved when we do. It talks about assertive outreach, and again, we see this now within Welsh policy, or certainly the action group recommendations. A shift from outreach services that essentially serve folk on the streets, enable people to remain, to have a really clear goal that says our job is to support you to get off the streets, and that's about having suitable accommodation, offer and support. Being housing led, our system is still wired towards transitional systems of temporary accommodation, often for long periods of time before accessing settled accommodation. But the most effective interventions are housing led. And finally, about being person-centered in our support, collaborative commissioning, and that comes up a little bit later again. So these are the principles of what works. And it's really interesting because hearing Flora and having read Flora's work about the design value conundrum, where you've got these great principles. We know what works. Why don't we do it? And one of the outputs from this study was a paper called What Works and Why We Don't Do It. So the why we don't do it, in the data, you can actually find a lot of the why things don't then happen, and a lack of settled accommodation where people actually want to live is one of the main barriers. That comes up in every study we undertake. Long-term sustainable funding. My goodness, this is an accusation in the Welsh context. We fund on annual basis, 2-year basis at best. Services need long-term sustainable funding to be able to invest in staff, for instance, and have some security for those staff. Often what undermines effective responses is the lack of collaboration, both in commissioning and delivery. People's access to public funding, so having no recourse to public funds, that undermines our ability to deliver services. And again, COVID has shown us what's possible when we remove those barriers. Overly bureaucratic processes are a barrier. And then finally, and this is a really important one, is strong political will. And there was a lot of people in the homes sector that have been saying this for a while, is, yeah, we know what works. We just need to go and do it. And we said that, I remember it as part of the Homes Action Group, we talked about this. Look, we've got the solutions, we've just got to go and see these through. And then again, COVID showed us what happens when you actually have that political will, when things are treated, when homelessness is treated as the crisis that it is. And yet this study predated COVID, talked about the importance of political will. And then when we see the impacts of COVID and the response, you see how powerful the response is when you have that political will. The next study, the 2019 study, basically sought to undertake a kind of a real course overview of what was happening around prevention in the UK, not getting into the real nitty gritty of an evaluation of, for instance, legislative implementation, but a top level view and a comparison. And one of the most important contributions actually from this study is the framework that we developed, recognizing that the public health framework that we so often rely on primary, secondary, tertiary prevention doesn't quite give the nuance and represent the temporal element that we need when trying to understand and drive forwards prevention of homelessness. So that typology talks about universal, targeted crisis, emergency and recovery prevention. And we basically explored how the different nations are performing against these domains. And the messages are, so at universal level, that's about poverty and housing markets primarily. And if we address those, we will have a massive impact on reducing homelessness. Now, of course, a lot of that lies at the doorstep of UK government and the social security safety net, but also for devolved governments, we do have powers, and the Bevan Foundation have been doing some great work around this. We do have some powers, but also at local authority level, RSL level, we've got the ability to invest in the housing market, social housing, and have a real impact on these kind of early drivers of homelessness. At the targeted level, the message is we need much, much better collaboration and investment in the services, the institutions from which people are becoming homeless. So prisons, the care system. Again, the evidence has been there for a very long time, and we've done very little to address the flow of people from those systems into homelessness. And it's the system failures that we need to address. And we have some of the solutions. And one of the most interesting areas that was being explored at the time and is now much further down the road is these wider public sector prevention duties that in Scotland they are currently looking at implementing. They have drafted ideas through an action group that the government pulled together with Crisis. And we talked about that when we reviewed the legislation in Wales, but it was decided to be, probably 2 or 3 steps too far to try and place duties on health, criminal justice, etc. Well, those that we had the powers to do so. And that's an area that I think we want to explore going forwards. And then at the kind of emergency end, the message was, look, we've got to do away with inappropriate hostels and shelters. And again, we've seen some of that in COVID. We were forced to close some of those because there was a recognition of the public health hazard that they created. We knew they were a public health hazard before, but they were allowed to persist. So an ending of some of those forms of accommodation, and then moved to embrace the kind of housing-led responses of rapid rehousing, housing first, etc. And then at recovery prevention, that's, if somebody has become homeless and we're trying to prevent homelessness recurring, then it's about investment in housing-related support. Our previously supporting people funding, which we had in Wales. The report recognises how Wales outperforms the other countries in this regard. But my goodness, it was a fight every year, every 2 years to retain that funding, let alone see an uplift in it. So they were the important messages from the homeless prevention study. The study that I wasn't involved in, but is an important one, digs deeper with a particular population subgroup, and it's done by a really good colleague, Kessia Reeve, and colleagues actually, that looked at the experiences of motherhood and homelessness, and particularly the experiences of mothers who aren't living with their children. So mothers living apart from their children and their experiences of going through the homelessness system. And really the findings are about the failings of the system in terms of the housing and the support that's being offered. Primarily that where we are providing accommodation, that accommodation doesn't then allow the children to return to the mother, and undermines that potential family unit. So the messages are about making sure that mothers, if they're presenting as single and homeless, are actually able to access accommodation that has space for their children to join them, so that these families can be brought back together. And there are all sorts of other kind of details in the study, including around collaboration. And I would touch on the fact that Rebecca Jackson is doing a PhD around domestic abuse and the importance of the collaboration around housing, legal services, children's social care, domestic abuse services too. But worth reading that study. And then finally, the fourth study is the most recent one, the interim report that I've produced with Suzanne Fitzpatrick and colleagues on the COVID-19 crisis response, this study across Great Britain. And what we see is just so important, because we see so many of the recommendations of other studies coming to fruition, and we see their impact. So some of the trends that we saw across Great Britain was strong central government leadership, a leadership that says, you are doing this is what has to happen, and if you don't do it, we're going to come and help you make it happen. And that's what we saw in Wales, getting everybody in, and to a similar extent, at least initially, in England. We also saw appropriate levels of funding in Wales to enable that to happen. Local authorities weren't wanting for funding to deliver. There were challenges around the availability of suitable accommodation, etc., but the funding was there. There were, at Westminster level, important changes to welfare and labour market policy. We saw and rental policy. So we had no evictions. We had an uplift in universal credit. We had an uplift in the local housing allowance rates, etc., etc. All those things enabled us to reduce the number of people who were becoming homeless. There was also great collaboration across sectors. There were challenges, but we saw health, homelessness, RSLs coming together in cells with Welsh Government, able to deliver on the needs of the population. We also saw a workforce that kind of adapted, rose to these unprecedented challenges. Sadly, that was often despite their kind of unequal standing alongside other health and social care workers. And there is a real fight to get equal recognition. Of course, there's been another win more recently around pay for those workers that I know Cymru has been fighting for. But then I think probably, well, not the most, but one of the most important findings is that because we basically had a natural experiment across Scotland, Wales and England. And of course, the conditions in Scotland prior to COVID were very, very different, because there was no priority need at all within the legislative framework. Everybody was entitled to temporary accommodation. And so the shift, the kind of the unprecedented shift and action that had to take place in Wales and England, and the unprecedented additional levels of funding weren't necessary in Scotland. And that's what we saw when you draw the comparisons. And it's almost a natural experiment that tells us the importance of removing some of those legislative barriers that we still have. And then finally, from that study, just looking to the horizon, there were some concerns over some of the move-on provisions, particularly in England, from those that have been temporarily accommodated in hotels, etc., and some of the potential, what we might call path dependencies of these major investments, sometimes in congregate forms of temporary accommodation. It's very difficult to decommission, as we know, some of these accommodation types. And there's a real concern that in the crisis, some forms of accommodation have been commissioned in Wales that we don't see as part of our midterm future. But on a more optimistic note, there's a real hope that some of these positive and progressive crisis policies are going to persist and evolve into something really quite positive, so that we can build back. And I will use the words fairer. I have totally pinched that from colleagues in the home sector, in Llanmai in particular, and in Cymru, because our report says build back better, but I've learned, and I will in the final report, talk about building back fairer. So that's it for the studies. When Bob and I sought to pull the document together that says what are our priorities for government, I was allowed 2 homelessness recommendations, and I've done what all good scholars do, and I've condensed 2 bullet points, about 16 bullet points into 2, the sort of thing I tell my students not to do. So I've just bunged them all into 2. So the primary recommendation is, let's move homeless prevention upstream. That's the direction of travel we're already taking, but the next Welsh Government has to continue in that, and I don't see much of that in any of the manifestos. So move upstream, look at the wider ranging public sector prevention duties and kind of cross-disciplinary and sectoral working, particularly around these high-risk groups and high-risk transitions. And we can do that together with colleagues in Scotland. And then at the crisis end, look, let's not go back to inappropriate hostels and shelters as our emergency solution, and really scale up at pace what we know works around these housing-led solutions, rapid rehousing, housing first, etc. And to do that, we need to remove some of the barriers that exist around priority need. See what I did? I just bunged everything into 2 bullet points. And the final one is around our workforce. There's a huge programme of work to do there. That's it from me. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete. As somebody said in the chat box, your final slide, you've expanded your 2 into 3. So there we go.
Who said that? Who spotted that? They're not a teacher, are they?
There are hands going up, and there are also, I think, questions in the chat box. Again, just to pick up on first question in the chat box, Viv Sugar's asked about any specific research on the impact of homelessness on children in Wales.
Yeah, good one. It's almost, Viv, like we planned this so I could talk about some of the other ESRC funded work we've been doing. I did concentrate on the cash study. I meant to say it almost feels disingenuous to talk just to the cash studies, because there's so much good work going on outside of cash. But one of the other areas that we've been doing quite a lot, and I'll talk to, is around administrative data linkage, and Ian Thomas, who's just a superstar with all of that, is leading it. And we've really put a focus on work there around children. And we've been able to link education data and homelessness data at an individual case level. And what it shows us is, of the children in homeless families, and it's important to kind of distinguish between youth homelessness, where it's a young person themselves becoming homeless, and family homeless, where you've got a child there. What we found is we were able to track, and this is case level with a really good number of households, the impacts that homelessness had on their schooling attendance. And you basically see homeless children in homeless families having, I think it's a 5-fold worse attendance record than those children in families that haven't experienced homelessness. And that's controlling for free school meals and other things. So it's a really important a really important finding. It's something we kind of had a sense of, but now we're able to quantify it. There's also, Erin, who's on the call here, and Nia, we're collectively doing a lot of work around mediation, its impacts of mediation is Nia's PhD, and the work that I'm doing with Erin is around something called Upstream, which is about going into schools to try and identify risk of homelessness and intervene. So yeah, there's quite a programme of work around.
I can see Stephen Evans has got his hand raised. Stephen, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Pete. That was really, really interesting. I was thinking on kind of one of the points you made there around kind of the political will. Kind of we knew what the solutions were, and then the pandemic changed the dynamic around that. And I was thinking, in your recent report, reflecting on what's gone on, are there any lessons there about what we can do to retain homelessness space, on that political will, thinking in particular of the context where a lot of the public services are going to be fighting for money now to, catch up the stuff they've lost. And also because we're, given the impact of pandemic on rent arrears and stuff, the happy political story is going to be more challenging when you've got far more people coming through the system maybe than in the past.
Stefan, you can probably answer this question better than me. You're more political than me. The reality is housing's always been the wobbly pillar of the welfare safety net, and just COVID was the opportunity. And it's actually sad, really, because we knew the impacts of homelessness on people, on families, and we thought that was a good enough motivation to drive political will and the funding that was needed. It was actually because it was a public health priority for the rest of us, partly, that we saw this. That's a bit disingenuous. Part of the motivation is that it was a public health impact for the rest of us, that things changed and there was that political will. However, Welsh Government, have committed not to go backwards on things like priority need that were amended during the crisis. So there are political commitments. How do you maintain that? I have no idea. When we get into a new government, I don't see much in the manifestos that fills me with hope that ending homelessness remains, right up there alongside health and education and the economy. I see it falling back again. So I'm not as optimistic. And we did, I have to say, we had a very good, the minister really drove forward change, and the team drove forward a lot of change in a short space of time, even prior to COVID. So I'm not sure I've got the answer to how we maintain that political will. As I say, I think you're more likely to have the answer to that. Tell me, please.
There's a couple of other questions in the chat box. One from Mark Jennings. I don't know, Mark, whether you want to ask your question directly.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Extremely hypothetical. Apologies for that, Peter. But I'm just wondering where you see current levels of COVID funding for homelessness going. Will we see that transition as out of the pandemic, or do you see a sort of cliff edge fall off in that funding?
It's a good, again, it probably follows on from a reply to Stefan, in that if you go by the manifestos, it doesn't appear that there would be that same commitment to kind of the post-COVID transition and whether we see the sorts of levels of funding that we had. And yet the track record even up to COVID was quite a positive one. There was a lot, the Homeless Action Group was pulled together and the minister, accepted in principle all the recommendations, and that included that there would need to be transitional funding. And when I say transitional funding, it was about the transition from a crisis, still a relatively crisis-led system, to a kind of prevention-focused system and truly prevention, moving further upstream. So again, I don't know, but as a sector, I think we've got to embrace what's happened in COVID and talk about what was achieved and achievable. And I guess I'm just hoping for the best, but there's nothing explicitly written in the manifestos that suggest that makes us think that that's going to be the case.
Thanks for that. There's also a question in the chat box from Rachel Honey-Jones about the upstreaming of prevention work. Rachel, do you want to come in?
Sorry, my apologies. I couldn't unmute myself or get my camera working. So I was just really interested in the upstream work that you just mentioned in terms of the PhD and whether that was related to the work that has recently been announced with United Welsh and Llamau.
Aha, so the United Welsh Work, that's the Youth Housing Association. Brilliant. That's part of End Youth Homelessness Cymru. Under that same umbrella of End Youth Homelessness Cymru, which is just driving so much change, we have an actual intervention called Upstream, which we've pinched from our Australian colleagues. It's a program called the Geelong Project, which I could talk about forever because it's my big agenda at the moment. Yeah, and I will talk about it just briefly, Bob, sorry, but we talk in public policy about not having, the silver bullet. And it's really, really rare, but I genuinely believe we've got the opportunity or the potential that it's not ending homelessness, but it is something that has the potential to have a really significant impact. Most of what we do has minor incremental change, positive impacts, we hope, but this one just has a real potential. The way that it works, and Llamau are the intervention partners for this and are helping to lead. I'm involved, Erin's involved. But we're working with schools, local authorities, and it works like this. We struggle really hard to identify those young people who are at risk. There is no data out there that tells us which young people might need some support to prevent them becoming homeless. We work with them when they present at the local authority at 16 or 17 because they've been kicked out for whatever reason. Upstream asks questions in a survey through the school about all sorts of things, but things that you just cannot find out elsewhere. And it tells you this young person might be at risk because last week they slept on a friend's sofa because they weren't allowed to stay at home. Things that you will not find out anywhere else. And it then identifies those young people. You're able to intervene with those young people. And the reality is, in that young person's life, you're able to mediate, address the conflict, understand with both the family and the young person about how you deal with that conflict. You have the potential to take being kicked out of home away. You have the potential to take that out of that journey from that young person's story. And this is how Tal, who's the coordinator, talks about it. Imagine being able to take homelessness out of a young person's story and everything that then changes later in their life. That's what Upstream tries to do. In Australia, it led to a 40% reduction in youth homelessness because it was delivered at scale in a place called Geelong. That's what we're trying to pilot in Wales at the moment. Anybody out there that has the funding to make it sustainable, because I talked about funding being the barrier, we're beg, stealing and borrowing from everywhere that we can. So, housing associations, if you're out there.
Any final questions?
Yeah, thanks Bob, and thanks Pete. Just reflecting on that sort of political, I just think it is super interesting, isn't it? Because there's so many things we've tried over the years, and they've been pilots or demonstrations or what have you, and they've been successful, but there's been this sort of expectation that they then get rolled out into the mainstream, but no kind of support, whether it's financial or other, really, to make that happen. And I think we've seen a change on that, around the Housing Act stuff, as you say, and then also around homelessness action group stuff and now COVID, and just whether that can be. But we also had been really lucky to have a minister who's really on the case, and she's also got the local government portfolio, so she kind of gets that thing about resources. Not if you just put them in the system unhypothecated, they don't always get where you might want them to go. So I share your somewhat, I don't know whether anxiety, well, it is anxiety actually, because I just think so much has been achieved, and we know, we've got a really clear direction of travel that we know we need to go in, and yet a few adverse decisions could take us actually backwards. So I just think we just have to be kind of really, I suppose, constructively vocal, don't we? And just making sure that when politicians say things like, oh yes, they kind of oblige statements about committed to ending homelessness and the plan, that they really understand what that involves. Not just it's not something you can just say and it'll just kind of, and then it'll be forgotten or it'll just happen. That there's a when we see how much the homelessness team within Welsh Government has expanded because of the pressures on them and the desire to do better. For me, that's just a tiny little indication of the focus that's needed. So I do share your concern. I haven't got any bright ideas apart from us collectively keeping on.
You because it is come up with solutions.
it's a human rights issue, it's a public health issue, it is an economic issue when it comes down to it. I think these things get so easily siloed, don't they? If people haven't got a home to live in, there's no way they going to be able to participate in employment and pay taxes and all the rest of it. So I think it's that thing of trying to get housing out of the homelessness out of the housing box into being seen holistically. And I think the pandemic's done that around public health. I guess we have to try and keep expanding that, both in terms of the prevention, the need for prevention in those other services, but just actually, if we end homelessness in Wales, we'll have a healthier, wealthy, fairer, all those future generation stuff will be a good chunk of achievement towards that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I see Viv has asked what's in place to brief incoming ministers about the priorities. That's a really good. I mean, the document that we're producing, that Bob and I have produced, that just summarises the cash evidence and summarises then priorities. That will be out on Monday-ish, we think, Bob, don't we? And that sets out what we think from the evidence priorities are. I assume this is how naive I am to politics, because I'm a researcher. I just assume if I produce something that makes sense, everybody wants to implement it, and that it doesn't work like that. But I'm assuming that officials must have a kind of a briefing process. Bob, you and well, Tamsin, of course, you'll know as well. So there must be something there.
There will be. We've got the slight matter of how what the government might look like politically, and then how the cabinet might look like, what the portfolios are, whether it requires teams within the civil service to reconfigure under the portfolios. There's a lot of ifs and buts. But yeah, there's always. I mean, I guess there'll just be so much landing on. Because particularly because we'll have quite a few new members, members of the Senedd as well, who've got to get their heads around the Senedd systems and processes. Some being virtual as well. So I suppose it's an issue about cutting through. I mean, I feel more positive about that in the sense that there's a substantive homelessness team now within the Welsh Government civil service structure. So it's not just a couple of people,
a much stronger voice than
yeah. So I think there is but it will be a challenge to cut through the and make sure that it stays as a really high priority with all the other stuff that's likely to be on the table.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce the point that I made at the beginning, and Pete said that hopefully the Cash Wales paper will be out at the beginning of next week. I think we're working on a shared blog as well to publicise the Wales and the Scotland papers, which have come out at the same sort of time. But as Tamsin said, it is a matter then of trying to make sure that the priorities, particularly I think the 12 priorities or key asks that we've identified are do reach the sort of the decision makers. And Pete's mentioned the 2 or 3 that he's put in relation to homelessness. As I say, there are others in relation to design value and tenant engagement that reflect some of the other work you've heard about this afternoon, including Tamsin will be pleased to know that we've flagged up the issue about the voice of tenants in Wales at the national level, which I think not only comes out from the work that Paul's talked about, but the work that Tamsin and HQN did for the Regulatory Board for Wales. So, as I say, we will be trying to disseminate that paper when it comes out next week, in particular, I think, to flag up the policy priorities and asks that we've referred to. Peter, was there anything else you want us to close? It's coming up to 3 o'clock.
Yeah, Viv just popped her hand up, and Gowan's just got a question, I think, as well.
Oh, right.
Sorry, I started typing. Just that influencing mustn't be confined to Cardiff and the Bay. It's got to be bottom up as well. All the organisations that are represented here today and more widely need to get hold of their local elected members, the regional MS, and make sure that they understand in a local context why this work is relevant to change on the ground where they live and in the areas that they represent.
Thanks, Viv. That's great. Gowan, did you want to come in? I see you've made the point about civil servants are already at work on briefing papers for the minister.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm so used to Teams, I've got no idea how to use Zoom, so sorry about that. But yeah, as I said in the comments, we are all, the civil service machine is fully active after the initial, oh, thank God they've kind of dissolved. We've got a couple of weeks to ourselves. Yeah, the machine is working and we are actively producing briefing for loads of different potential outcomes. So the way it works usually is that the general stuff goes up first about how we all work, and especially for the newbies, and then it gets more focused to the portfolio specifics and stuff. But as I say, now we're drafting stuff like that, so now's the time to send those emails pushing people to include stuff. But I did not say that, although I have just realised this is now recorded. Anywho, moving on, it's Friday afternoon.
Thanks, Gowan. Yeah, as I say, it is Friday afternoon, it is 3 o'clock. Thanks for all of you for attending and participating in the session this afternoon, particularly given how nice the weather is, and I'm sure that many people will want to get out and enjoy the fresh air for the remaining hours of sunlight. Thanks to all three of our keynote speakers this afternoon, Flora, Paul and Pete. I know Flora and Paul have had to leave, but hopefully you found the presentations interesting, covering, I think, some of the diverse range of research that Cash has been involved in. Can I also thank Ethan Lom from the School of Geography and Planning, who's done so much to help organise the event. Pete, anything else you want to add at the last stage?
Thank you for doing all the running around as well.
Great, thanks for that. And well, unless there's anything else on that note, as I say, we'll wish you an enjoyable weekend. Thanks again, and diolch yn fawr.